What are the best settings for this monitor? By best settings, I mean the settings I adopted in my review as my test settings. These suited my own preferences, they worked on my unit, and it allowed my colorimeters to reach the targets I usually go for. Individual units and preferences will vary, so these will not be optimal in all cases. So the first part of the menu, Game Setting, that allows you to select a game mode if you want to. You'll notice I have that set to off. These are just presets which will make various adjustments to the image which I find undesirable, which is why I've left this off. If you like how any of them look, then of course feel free to use them. For example, the FPS mode has a punchier, more saturated and oversaturated look. You lose shade variety as a result, so it's not as natural or well balanced, but you might like how it looks. You might like to use Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3 if you like to use different settings for different games as well, and you can just tweak them to your liking. The next thing in the game setting menu, which I would check, is adaptive sync. Make sure that's set to on if you want to use VRR, the variable refresh rate functionality of the monitor. I believe it was actually on by default anyway, but do check that. Another thing, if you're using HDMI, you probably want to set HDMI 1 to PC rather than console/DVD. And console/DVD is a compatibility setting for older devices. So if you're using a device and you can't get a proper signal using HDMI, you could try this compatibility setting. Usually it would be set to that by default, so you'd actually have to change this to PC. If you want to use the full capabilities of the screen, including up to 240Hz on a PC, via HDMI, at the native resolution, then you do have to have this set to PC anyway. Next, in luminance, I left a lot of this at default. Anything I'm not mentioning here, by the way, is left at default, so that includes the contrast being left at 50. But brightness, I set that to 60. And that got close to my usual 160 nits target, which I go for consistency in my reviews, and it suits my lighting environment and my own preferences. But please do adjust this brightness according to your own lighting environment and preferences. OLED Care, I'll go through that a little bit later. In colour setup, I made some adjustments. I set the colour temp to user, set red to 47, green to 48, and blue to 50. And that got close to my usual 6500K white point target with a good neutral green channel on my unit. Individual units do vary in this respect, so these aren't necessarily going to be optimal for you. And with all this said, some people prefer a more toned down, natural sRGB representation. And one way you could achieve that, it's also found in colour setup, and that's to change colour gamut to sRGB. There's also DCI-P3 mode. These are explored in the review in a bit more detail, but the sRGB mode will clamp things closer to sRGB. Assuming you're not using sRGB emulation on the systems, for example, you're not using Windows ACM, Auto Color Management. You might also notice with sRGB selected, it greys out your color channels, so you can't adjust them manually. You can adjust the brightness and the sharpness if you wish, but everything else on the luminance menu is also grayed out using the sRGB setting. As usual, I do explore the sRGB setting, but I like to test the monitor using the full native gamut, which means that panel native is selected for most of the review. And that's all I changed. So game setting, game mode was disabled, adaptive sync set to on, in luminance, brightness was set to 60, and in color setup, I set the color temp to user, left color gamut at panel native, and I changed red to 47, green to 48, and blue to 50. I didn't adjust R saturation, G saturation, B saturation, or any of the other saturation or hue controls. But if you wish to tweak them according to your own preferences, perhaps you just want to tone down reds a little bit because you're finding them a bit fiery, but you don't really want to touch the other colours, then you could do that. You could reduce the red saturation a little bit. You do have that flexibility on this monitor. I'm now going to cover HDR. So when you're not feeding the monitor an HDR signal, I'm just using SDR at the moment. You might notice there's HDR mode listed, and that can be set to off, HDR picture, HDR movie, or HDR game. These are just weird filters, they're basically additional presets. There's nothing HDR about this at all. I'm not feeding the monitor an HDR signal. So if you're wanting to use HDR on the monitor and you only see these listed, it's because you aren't sending an HDR signal. I've just enabled HDR on Windows, and you should notice straight away that color setup is grayed out completely. And when I go to luminance, there are other HDR settings available. So there's off display HDR, HDR peak, HDR picture, HDR movie, and HDR game. I like to use the Windows HDR calibration tool to help give an idea of the relative brightness calibration for HDR. In-game calibration sliders should show similar behaviour, though that can depend on the game and how they've set the HDR calibration options up. Just remember this tool gives an indication of the relative calibration of the screen, not the actual brightness levels you'll experience. I'm using the display HDR mode at the moment, so that is your display HDR True Black 400 setting, and that provides a consistent and relatively well calibrated experience, but with limited peak brightness. It blocks access to various settings that are available in the other HDR modes. The brightness reported in this test using this mode, Display HDR, is 450 nits, which is very close to the actual physical peak luminance recorded in the review. There are two presets on the monitor which will give the highest peak brightness, potentially up to around 1000 nits. One of these is HDR Game, which I've just switched over to. You could use HDR Movie or HDR Picture if you prefer and increase brightness to 100. They're set to lower brightnesses by default. But these also include a moderately strong, in the case of HDR Picture, or obnoxiously strong, in the case of HDR Movie, sharpness filter, which can't be properly counteracted. HDR Game includes a much milder sharpness filter, which I find undistracting given the excellent pixel density of the monitor. You can also tweak the sharpness a bit using the OSD sharpness control if you wish. And the brightness reported in this test using HDR Game, at least according to how I perceive it on my unit, is 530 nits. Ideally, the brightness reported here would be in line with the actual capability of the display, which is around 1000 nits. So it's roughly half the actual luminance capability of the screen using this setting. Sometimes this large mismatch between the brightness mapping and actual luminance capability of the screen can be a problem, as you need to calibrate the monitor in-game, or using this tool, in a way that will really limit the peak luminance performance, or that will massively crush highlight detail. Fortunately, AOC has calibrated this mode on the monitor in a way that avoids that, but if the in-game calibration includes a numerical value for HDR brightness, remember to set this around 530 nits if you use this setting, rather than closer to the actual peak brightness value of around 1000 nits. At least this was all correct on my unit. And if you watch a lot of HDR Movie content or you play games that don't have an in-game calibration slider for HDR, or a poor one, then it's probably worth running through the Windows HDR calibration tool and using the profile it creates for HDR. There's also an HDR preset on the monitor called HDR Peak, which I've just switched over to. And you might have noticed it actually caused the screen to reset its signal. There was a bit of a display blanking and it's closed my full screen application, so I need to reopen it. So if you switch when you're playing a game, you might find that your game is minimized and you need to reactivate HDR on the game as well. The brightness reported in this test using the HDR Peak setting appears to be spot on 1000 nits, and that coincides nicely with the actual luminance capability of the screen. But let's move on to some HDR gameplay and talk more about these settings. I'm currently using the HDR Peak setting, and you'll notice that you've got a few other settings you can configure. So there's a shadow control, and what this will do is it will give you an uplift of shadow detail. Specifically, it will raise dark shades up so that they're more visible. So if you raise this all the way up to 20, you can set this in increments of 1, so you get good flexibility in that respect. It gives quite a crushed together uplifted look. It improves visibility, but the game loses a lot of its atmosphere, so you don't get the same definition with the shadows because they're raised up. It doesn't affect pure black, but even very dark shades do get uplifted, so a lot of the shadow details look artificially elevated. But again, if you're finding that you're playing games where things just aren't visible enough in dark areas, you may consider doing this kind of thing. I'm just going to set that back to 0. But if you do want an uplifted look, you might actually want to consider switching over to HDR Game. I mentioned before that HDR Movie and HDR Picture could be used as well, and you can tweak things to your liking there, but they do have that obnoxious sharpness filter. And because I've switched over from HDR Peak to HDR Game, I do have to reactivate HDR, so just give me a sec to do that. There we go. So using this setting, you again get flexibility to, for example, adjust shadow control if you wish, but even in its default state, there's a definite uplift to the image. The darkest shades actually remain very deep and inky, unlike when you're using Shadow Boost, so that means that objects still have a nice defined look with their finer shadow details, but a broad range of medium and medium dark shades are brighter than intended. So the rock textures here, other than the shadow details, are brighter than intended. So they kind of stand out a bit more, and some people do like that look. But in scenes like this where you've got a lot of dark detail, you might find the uplift too strong and it kind of gives a less atmospheric look to things. So if you're sitting in a dark room or a dimly lit room as I am now, you might find things just look too uplifted. So remember, this is using HDR Game, and this is using HDR Peak. Not sure how this will appear in the video, but to my eyes there's a lot more depth to a lot of those medium dark shades now, which looks more appropriate. However, remember I'm sitting in a dark or dimly lit room. Brighten things up a bit. It's not a bright room, but it's sort of moderately bright now. And using this HDR peak setting, I find that some of these details can't really be appreciated in the same way, and actually a little bit of an uplift as you would get with the HDR game setting would be appreciated. So I'm just going to switch over to that. There you go. Easier to appreciate these subtle details now. I've switched back to the HDR peak setting. As explored in the review, if you're in a high APL average picture level scene where bright shades become more dominant, as they do here when looking at the sky, the monitor drags down medium shades when using the HDR peak setting. This is standard behaviour for a QD OLED. I've now switched over to the HDR game setting and I can see a much brighter and more appropriate look to this scene overall. It doesn't have that unintended overcast appearance to the sky or an overly dull look to some other elements in the scene. This sort of look isn't achieved with the HDR peak setting, even if you tweak settings like dark boost, by the way. And since I've mentioned dark boost but haven't actually shown you this, you can set that to level 1, level 2 or level 3. And you'll see this gives quite an uplift to a lot of brighter and medium bright shades. So where your shadow control focuses more on your dark shades, the dark boost gives an uplift to some of your brighter shades. So I can see that for the trees in the background, vegetation in the background, and also the hut there, especially the roof there. So if you prefer how this looks, that is something you can do, but as I said, it doesn't change the dimming behaviour of the different modes. So you can't use HDR peak, tweak this and expect things to look like they do in HDR game. And I'm going to run all the way through the HDR calibration wizard. I'm using the HDR game setting. Now, the reason for this will become apparent very shortly. So you can set the minimum luminance here to 0, so all the way to the left for the slider. This you set according to what you see by eye, so I would set this to 530 for this mode on my monitor. And that's for the maximum luminance. The next part looks at the max full frame luminance, and that should be again 530. That was correct on my unit. But this is what I really wanted to get to, and that is colour saturation. And you want to have that slider all the way to the right, so the maximum it can be. And then you will save the profile, call it whatever you want. Now the reason I've done this is covered in the review, and that's because the monitor fails to use its nice wide colour gamut appropriately under HDR. And that's regardless of whether your content is designed with sRGB, DCI-P3 or Rec 2020 in mind. There will be less coverage of the target gamut than there should be. This is reduced slightly if you use HDR game compared to, for example, HDR peak, or indeed the regular HDR setting. And some PC and console users would actually be happy to just use that as it is without maxing the HDR saturation slider on the Windows HDR calibration tool. But as a PC user, you can get a nice boost to saturation regardless of HDR mode being used by maxing out the saturation slider in the Windows HDR calibration tool and using the profile it creates. And you can always play with slightly lower saturation boost levels if you prefer. So to try and give you a quick example, this is what things look like with the saturation slider maxed on the HDR calibration tool. And this is what things look like by default without the saturation slider adjusted. Now I don't know how that's going to look on the video, it's always difficult to capture this appropriately, but just to my eye, there's a lot of undersaturation now to Lara's skin, some underdone greens as well, and not enough richness even to the rocky tones. Some elements are actually a bit oversaturated when you max the saturation slider when you're using the HDR game setting, but I think most people are going to really prefer this kind of look to the more subdued, muted look that you get without touching the saturation slider. And I can even see Lara's dress here just looks far more muted than it should. And just to see again if I can capture some of the difference, this is again with the saturation slider minimized, so the default. And this is with the saturation slider dragged all the way to the right, so maxed out. So to summarise all of this, if you want a consistent and relatively well-calibrated HDR experience but you're not interested in high peak brightness, consider using Display HDR. If you want a deep and atmospheric look to darker scenes and they feature heavily in the games you play, and you sit in dim enough lighting conditions to really appreciate that side of things, but at the same time you want some strong brightness peaks to bring excellent contrast to such scenes, then you likely want to use the HDR peak setting. If you're happy with an uplifted look to things, potentially more appropriate if you're sitting in a bright or at least moderately bright room, and you don't want medium shades to be dragged down in those high APL scenes where bright shades are more dominant, then you should strongly consider the Game HDR setting. Having extensively used various HDR modes on this monitor, I would generally side with this latter setting, Game HDR, or Display HDR if I want to give my eyes a bit of a break. When using the monitor myself for my own enjoyment rather than specific testing, I don't usually sit in a dark room when using a high peak brightness HDR mode. So the uplifted look can make more sense, the uplifted look to the HDR game mode that is. And I have to say, as I've used QD OLEDs more and more, the dimming of medium shades in high APL scenes, for example using the HDR peak setting, it is something which I like to avoid if possible. Back to SDR now, although this is applicable to both HDR and SDR. OLED Care / Extra. So I'm going to look at the OLED Care options, starting off with the pixel refresh, because that's really the main one you'll want to consider, and is something which sort of becomes part of using the monitor really. This is the usual voltage cycling which runs to try to reduce or eliminate image retention on the monitor. The cycle lasts around 10 minutes and will want to run every 4 hours. So if you select yes, you can manually run the cycle, as is shown here by selecting yes. Alternatively, you can just let the monitor run its cycle itself when it's switched off, and that is to say that you've switched it off using the power button, so you've held the control joystick in for a few seconds. That's how you turn the monitor off in that way, although you do still need it connected to the power for it to run the cycle, and it will try to do this after every 4 hours of cumulative use. If you have auto warning enabled, I've got that set to off because I don't much like this warning. So with the auto warning, you'll see this message appear on the screen. This is actually from another AOC monitor, but it should be a similar message in this case. If you don't have the auto warning option enabled, then you won't see this message, but the behavior is still going to be the same. I mean, you can select yes to manually run the cycle if you see the message, but either way, it is going to be trying to run the cycle if you've cumulatively used the monitor for 4 hours, and it will run that cycle either when the screen goes to sleep, so Windows Power Management has told the monitor to switch off, but that isn't really switching it off. That puts it in a low power state, which means that the monitor will actually wait 2 hours before running the cycle, so that's not really particularly useful. If, however, you hold down that joystick and turn the monitor off, and you've cumulatively used the monitor for 4 hours since the last cycle was run, then it will run the cycle again immediately. So given all of this, it probably is good to actually get into the habit of switching the screen off when you're not using it. And when it is running its cycle, the power indicator pulses white, and it will turn orange if the screen is in standby, or it will switch off if you held the joystick in for a few seconds to switch the screen off before it ran its cycle. Regardless of how you set up auto warning, the monitor will force a panel refresh with a warning message 10 minutes before, after 16 hours of cumulative use. At least I'm assuming that's the case, based on earlier AOC QD OLEDs I've tested. I didn't ever cumulatively use this monitor for that long without the refresh cycle being run, and the manual of this monitor is less insightful than some of the earlier manuals, at least at time of review, when it comes to this kind of behaviour, so I can't confirm that it's definitely the case here. And also, if you scroll down in the OLED Care / Extra menu, you'll see it says time after pixel refresh, so 5.4 hours. So I've been a little bit naughty and haven't run it for a while, so I should probably do that after this video. But I wouldn't freak out too much if you don't run it strictly every 4 hours. But to be honest, 4 hours is a fairly aggressive cycle as far as QD OLEDs go for this kind of setting. And it gives you a total pixel refresh count, which in my case is 17, so how many times it's run the cycle. As for the other settings, there's pixel orbiting, and that's set to weak by default. You can have that set to off, weak, medium or strong. And what this does is there is a border of unused pixels around the image between the panel border, so that's the physical border of the panel and the image. And the image will bounce around within this border, so it'll shift up, down, left or right periodically. And with the weak setting, it won't do this very often. Medium will do a little bit more, and strong it'll do it even more. So you can just set this according to your own preferences. But I would generally recommend leaving this at least set to weak if you can bear it and it's not really annoying you. It doesn't personally annoy me with the weak setting, which is why I left it there. But you might notice that I've actually disabled a lot of the other settings. In fact, I've disabled all of the other settings. Screensaver, logos protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and thermal protection. The reason for that is really that I don't want them to interrupt the review. Not necessarily that I find them bothersome, although perhaps I do find some of them bothersome sometimes, just personally. But my recommendation here is to enable as many of these as you can bear. And if they bother you, then you can disable them. There is that option. Or with some of them, you can set them to less aggressive levels. So for screensaver, for example, there's off, slow, or fast. And this dims the screen after a static image is detected for a certain amount of time, where fast will do this more quickly than slow. Small movements like the clock changing or a cursor blinking won't stop the feature from activating. I didn't time exactly how long it took to kick in, but it looks to be a few minutes for fast and sometime within 10 minutes for slow. The dimming is fairly subtle, so I'd generally recommend using Windows Power Management to send the screen to sleep when you're not using it for a few minutes instead, or just turn the screen off as I was mentioning before. Either way, that doesn't just dim the pixels slightly, but it actually shuts them off. Next, you've got logos protection. You can have that set to off, 1, 2, 3, or 4, with a high number being a more aggressive dimming for the logos. Really, it's designed to dim the screen if static logos or other static elements are detected. Unlike some features of this nature, it dims the whole screen rather than just specific elements. And that could still be useful, but it's a bit of a different approach to just dimming the logos or the static elements themselves. Next, you've got boundary dimmer. That can be again set to off, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And on some OLED models, this kind of feature will dim the boundary between strongly contrasting elements such as the edges of windows. With AOC models like this, it seems to be focused on dimming boundaries if you set the screen to an aspect ratio which gives black bars around the image, or you're using the PIP, picture-in-picture, or possibly P by P, picture-by-picture feature. And there's taskbar dimmer, which can be set to off, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that dims the brightness of the taskbar area. And set to 4, this had a fairly noticeable effect, even with the dark-themed taskbar I'm using. On other AOC models I reviewed previously, this only went up to 3 and had a less aggressive effect. So it's good to see what appears to be a more aggressive setting included here. And the final setting of note here is thermal protection. And that keeps the monitor's temperature under 60 degrees by reducing brightness level when it gets close to that. So if you want to do everything you can to maximize panel longevity, this is something that might make sense, but I wouldn't stress too much if you prefer to disable the feature as you're finding it's dimming too often. I haven't experimented with this to see how likely it is to kick in and what effect it has on brightness, but as with other settings, I'd recommend trying it out and just disable it if you find it annoying. A few other settings to go through. If you press the joystick down without going into the main menu, you get this little crosshair, little dial point crosshair in the middle of the screen. It's black by default. If you press it down again, it's a red crosshair. You can't change the design and you can't change the position of the crosshair. But if you find this crosshair's there and you don't know why and you can't get rid of it, because I have had people note this before on AOC models, which is really the main reason I want to go through this, then you just press the joystick in the down direction until that crosshair disappears. I'd also like to quickly go through something else which is on OLED Care /Extra, and that is the USB selection, because this is relevant for the KVM functionality of the monitor, because on some monitors you might look out for KVM switch or KVM or something like that to control the KVM behavior. On this monitor, the relevant setting is USB selection. If you have this set to auto, then it should automatically select the USB port used for upstream data for you. So this would probably use USB-C if you're using a system connected via USB-C, otherwise it would be using USB up, which is the USB-B port. But if you wish to manually configure this, so you're definitely using USB-C for the upstream data, or you're using your USB Type-B port for the upstream data, you can do that here. And if you press the joystick up, incidentally, without being in the main menu system, then you can easily select the input used by the monitor. And the final thing I'd like to go through is visibility enhancements. I've got lagom.nl, the website, the black levels test there open. So this is just using my default settings. Be aware that what you see in the video does not represent what you'd see by eye, but it will give an example of the relative change the setting they're going to show you will make. I did show you these briefly with HDR, but I'm just going to revisit them here. So there's shadow control, and that gives a good uplift. It doesn't affect your black point, so it doesn't affect the contrast of the screen. It's reasonably selective, so it doesn't affect your brightest shades, doesn't really affect medium bright shades either, but it does affect medium dark shades. A bit like what I showed you under HDR with the game examples, it works in a similar way under SDR. So it can give you a competitive edge if you drag that up if that's what you want. Alternatively, you might want to be using dark boost, and again I showed you that with HDR. Level 1, level 2, level 3, with this being less selective in that it will have more of an effect for somewhat brighter shades as well. This has a bit of a different effect, and you can combine these, so you could have this set to level 3 and shadow control set all the way up to 20 if you wish. Alternatively, if you want a more subtle boost and you don't want to affect the image in the same way as these settings do, just disable both of them again. There are a few other settings and presets which would give you an uplift as well. So for example, HDR game gives reasonable uplift. Remember, this is with an SDR signal, so HDR game, it's not actually HDR, it's just an extra preset of the monitor really. And just having quickly looked at them, none of the game modes really do much to affect those dark shades. And sometimes on AOC monitors, switching gamma from gamma 1, which is the default, over to gamma 2 gives a bit of an uplift, and it does in this case as well, but it doesn't really affect the very dark shades so much. It's pretty subtle, so it's not really going to do too much for you. So again, I'd recommend using shadow control, dark boost, set according to your own preferences. or if you want to, HDR game. And be aware that when you're using HDR game under SDR, you can't actually adjust shadow control or dark boost.